The night was alive with the hum of 1,000 tiny lives. Crickets sang their haunting melodies, their sharp, rhythmic chirps cutting through the dense, humid air of the forest. The faint scent of wet earth mingled with the metallic tang of distant rain. Ethan Rhodes stood at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting on the cold steel of his utility rifle, scanning the darkness for movement. He wasn't supposed to be here, not tonight, not on this forsaken planet where every step was a gamble between survival and death. But something had called him. It had started with the signal. A faint, irregular blip on his scanner, barely distinguishable from the background noise of the planet's electromagnetic storms. Most miners would have ignored it, chalking it up to interference. But Ethan was not most miners. His curiosity, and the promise of a payout for salvage tech, had dragged him deeper into the wilderness than he had planned. Now, standing in the clearing, surrounded by the towering shadows of alien trees, he realized he wasn't alone. The ship was a wreck, its jagged metal hull scorched and twisted, half buried in the muck. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before, sleek and organic, its design almost serpentine. Pale blue lights flickered weakly along its surface, as though the ship itself were gasping for air. But what held Ethan's attention wasn't the ship, it was the sound. A faint, desperate cry drifted from within the wreckage, a sound so hauntingly human it sent shivers racing down his spine. He hesitated, his instincts warring with his conscience. He had learned the hard way that nothing on this planet could be trusted, not the terrain, not the creatures, and certainly not his own gut. But that cry, that fragile, pleading sound, refused to let him walk away. Ethan slung his rifle across his back and approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The air grew colder as he neared the ship, the glow of its damaged hull casting eerie shadows on his face. He reached the edge of a torn opening and peered inside. "Hello?" he called, his voice low and steady. "Is someone there?" A sharp hiss answered him, followed by the scuffle of movement. His grip tightened on the hilt of his knife as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. And then he saw her. She was unlike any being he had ever encountered. Slumped against the wall, her pale, silver-toned skin shimmered faintly under the ship's flickering lights. Her form was humanoid, but her elongated limbs and delicate, iridescent patterns marked her as something otherworldly. Her eyes, impossibly large and filled with a swirling mixture of gold and blue, locked onto his with a ferocity that froze him in place. Beside her, a child no older than 6 cowered, clutching her arm. His features were similar to hers, delicate and otherworldly, but his fear was unmistakably universal. The boy's small, translucent hands trembled as he clung to his mother, his wide eyes darting between Ethan and the wreckage. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ethan said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I heard the signal. Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling erratically. Blood, or something close to it, oozed from a wound on her side, staining her silken clothing. Ethan's gaze flicked to the child, whose tear-streaked face was half hidden behind her arm. "They'll come," she rasped suddenly, her voice melodic but strained. Each word seemed to cost her an immense effort. "They'll find us. You must leave." "Who's coming?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer, but the fear in her eyes was answer enough. Whatever, or whoever, they were running from was more dangerous than the hostile environment around them. Ethan knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a medkit from his pack and opened it. "I'm not leaving you here," he said firmly. "Let me help." Her gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, her guard seemed to lower. She nodded weakly, allowing him to examine her wound. The child whimpered, and Ethan glanced at him with what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his tone gentler. The boy didn't respond, but his mother answered for him. "Ael," she whispered. "His name is Ael. And you?" Ethan asked, carefully applying a patch to her wound. "Zara," she murmured, her voice growing fainter. "Zara," Ethan repeated, testing the name on his tongue. Well, Zara, I've got a ship not far from here. I can take you and Ael somewhere safe. But we need to move now. Zara's eyes widened in alarm. No, you don't understand. They will track us. Ethan frowned. Who are they? As if in answer, the distant whine of engines echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing second. Zara's grip tightened on Ael, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. Hunters, she said, her voice trembling. They're coming. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't have time to question her further. Whatever these hunters were, they were close, and they wouldn't stop until they found their prey. He scooped Ael into his arms, ignoring the child's startled cry, and helped Zara to her feet. We have to go, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Zara nodded weakly, leaning heavily on him as they stumbled out of the wreckage. The forest around them came alive with sound, the engines growing louder, the distant crackle of comms, the rustle of leaves as something inhuman moved through the trees. Ethan's grip tightened on Zara and Ael. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: the hunters were coming, and he wasn't going to let them take her. As they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the ship behind them erupted in a flash of light, consuming itself in a fiery explosion. The shockwave sent a shiver through the ground, and Ethan knew there was no turning back now. Somewhere in the darkness, the hunters closed in. The forest was alive with sound, a symphony of danger that prickled the edges of Ethan's nerves. The whine of engines echoed through the dense canopy, blending with the rustle of alien foliage and the sharp cries of nocturnal predators. Ethan adjusted his grip on Zara, her weight leaning heavily against him as they moved through the uneven terrain. Ael clung to his back, his small hands gripping Ethan's jacket, his soft, frightened breaths brushing against his neck. The thick scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of burned metal from the exploded ship behind them. Every step felt like a gamble. The forest floor was riddled with unseen roots, patches of slick mud, and creatures that lurked just out of sight, their glowing eyes tracking the trio from the shadows. Can you walk faster? Ethan asked, his voice low but urgent. I'm trying, Zara replied, her words strained with pain. The faint glow of her silver-toned skin dimmed with each labored step, a clear sign that her energy was waning. I just need a moment. Ethan's jaw tightened. We don't have a moment. They're too close. As if to punctuate his words, a sharp, mechanical whir pierced the air, a drone, its red sensor light slicing through the darkness like a blade. Ethan froze, pulling Zara into the cover of a large tree with bark as smooth and cold as glass. Ael whimpered softly, burying his face against Ethan's shoulder. Quiet, Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the treetops. The drone hovered a few meters above them, its sensors sweeping back and forth. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for the EMP device strapped to his belt. Stay still, he mouthed to Zara, his voice barely audible. Zara nodded, her golden blue eyes wide with fear. Ethan pressed the button, and a faint hum emanated from the device. The drone's light flickered once, twice, before sputtering out completely. It dropped to the ground with a soft thud, its lifeless shell sinking into the mud. Zara exhaled shakily, her body trembling against Ethan's side. You've done this before. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Something like that. Come on. They pressed on, the oppressive darkness of the forest closing in around them. Ethan's mind raced, weighing their limited options. The hunters wouldn't stop, they never did. They were relentless, trained to track and kill without hesitation. And with Zara injured, their chances of survival were dwindling by the second. Where are we going? Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a cave system about a mile from here, Ethan replied. It's deep enough to hide us for a while, and the terrain will slow them down. Zara hesitated, glancing at Ael, who had fallen silent but still clung to Ethan with a desperate grip. He's exhausted, she said softly. We need to rest. Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Rest? Do you hear that? In the distance, The unmistakable sound of heavy boots crunching through underbrush reached their ears. The hunters were close. Zahra flinched but held her ground. "He's just a child," she said, her voice shaking with equal parts fear and determination. "He can't keep going like this." Ethan's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at Ael. The boy's translucent skin glowed faintly in the dark, his small face pale with exhaustion. Ethan cursed under his breath, his resolve hardening. "All right," he said, scanning the area. His eyes fell on a cluster of large, moss-covered rocks partially concealing a shallow hollow. "There. It's not perfect, but it'll do for now." They ducked into the hollow, the cool, damp air offering a temporary reprieve. Ethan lowered Ael gently onto the ground, pulling a thin thermal blanket from his pack and wrapping it around the boy. Ael blinked up at him, his golden eyes glassy with fatigue. "Thank you," Zahra murmured, sinking down beside Ael. She winced as she adjusted her injured side, her hand instinctively moving to shield the boy. Ethan knelt opposite her, his gaze sharp. "We can't stay long. 10 minutes tops. After that, we're moving, no matter what." Zahra nodded, though her expression remained strained. "I understand." For a moment, silence fell over them, broken only by the distant sounds of the forest. Ethan studied Zahra, his mind racing with questions he didn't have time to ask. Who was she really? What had she done to make her such a target? And why couldn't he bring himself to abandon her and Ael, even when every survival instinct screamed at him to cut his losses? Zahra met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You don't owe us anything." Ethan snorted softly. "Yeah, well, my conscience would disagree." Zahra tilted her head, her expression softening. "You've lost someone, haven't you?" Ethan stiffened, the question hitting far too close to home. He didn't answer, instead busying himself with checking his rifle. Zahra didn't press him, but her gaze lingered, her own pain reflected in her eyes. "I lost Ael's father to the war," she said after a moment, her voice heavy with sorrow. "He sacrificed himself so we could escape. But it feels hollow, knowing it might all be for nothing." Ethan looked up, his jaw tightening. "It's not for nothing," he said firmly. "Not if you survive." Before Zahra could respond, a distant roar shattered the fragile quiet. Ethan's head snapped toward the sound, his heart lurching. "Move!" he ordered, pulling Zahra to her feet and scooping Ael into his arms. They stumbled out of the hollow just as a shadow passed overhead, a massive, winged creature with glowing red eyes, its screech echoing through the forest. "What is that?" Zahra gasped, her voice trembling. "Trouble," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on Ael. The creature circled back, its powerful wings stirring the air. Ethan's mind raced as he weighed his options. The cave was their only chance, but reaching it meant crossing open ground, a deadly gamble with the hunters and the predator now on their trail. "Run," he said, his voice sharp. "And don't look back." As they broke into a sprint, the creature let out another bone-chilling screech, diving toward them with lethal intent. The cavern walls were alive with bioluminescent fungi, their soft green glow casting shifting patterns across the jagged rock. The faint drip of water echoed in the enclosed space, masking the frantic breaths of Ethan, Zahra, and Ael as they huddled behind a large stone outcropping. Ethan crouched at the edge of the group, his rifle cradled in his hands, his eyes fixed on the narrow entrance they had come through moments earlier. "Is it gone?" Zahra whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched Ael close to her, her silver-toned skin still pale from their harrowing sprint. "For now," Ethan replied, his tone clipped. His heart was still pounding from the chase, the image of the winged predator's glowing red eyes burned into his mind. "But it won't stay gone. Things like that don't give up easily." Ael shifted in Zahra's arms, his small fingers clutching at her torn sleeve. "I'm scared," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Zahra pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "I know, my love," she said softly. "But you're safe now. Ethan won't let anything happen to us." Ethan glanced over his shoulder at her words, his expression unreadable. The weight of her trust settled heavily on his shoulders, but he didn't correct her. He couldn't promise safety, not here, not against the things that hunted them. But he would try. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he would try. The cavern stretched deeper into the mountainside, a labyrinth of twisting tunnels and hidden alcoves. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of minerals. Ethan scanned the area, searching for a defensible position. "We can't stay near the entrance," he said, his voice low. "If that thing finds us, we need a fallback point, somewhere we can make a stand." Zahra nodded, her movements slow and deliberate as she adjusted Ael in her arms. "Do you think it's still, out there?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Probably. And if it's not, those hunters are." The memory of the creature's screech still echoed in his ears. Its massive wings had stirred the air like a hurricane, and its claws had torn through the trees as it dove after them. It had been fast, too fast. They had barely made it into the cave in time. Now, every second felt borrowed. Ethan led them deeper into the cavern, his boots crunching softly against the uneven ground. The glowing fungi grew more vibrant the farther they went, their light illuminating the way like faint, ethereal lanterns. He noticed Zahra struggling to keep pace, her injured sides slowing her down. Without a word, he reached out and took Ael from her arms, the boy clinging to him without protest. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Zahra nodded, though her expression betrayed her exhaustion. "I'll manage." Ethan didn't press her, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the path ahead. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, they reached a large chamber deep within the cave. Stalagmites jutted up from the ground like jagged teeth, and a small pool of water glimmered in the center, its surface disturbed by the occasional drip from above. Ethan set Ael down gently and began to inspect the area. "This will do," he said finally. "It's defensible, and the tunnels give us a few escape routes if we need them." Zahra sank onto a flat rock, her hand pressed to her side. Ethan noticed the faint sheen of blood on her fingers and frowned. "You're still bleeding." "It's nothing," she said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan dropped his pack onto the ground and pulled out his medkit. "It's not nothing," he said firmly. "Let me see." Zahra hesitated, her gaze flickering to Ael, who sat quietly beside her. "He doesn't need to see this." Ethan nodded. "Ael, come here," he said, motioning the boy over. "You can help me with something." Ael looked up at his mother, who gave him a reassuring nod, before crossing the chamber to stand beside Ethan. Ethan handed him a small flashlight and pointed to the tunnel they had come through. "Keep an eye on that entrance. Let me know if you see or hear anything, okay?" Ael nodded solemnly, gripping the flashlight tightly as he turned his attention to the task. Ethan moved back to Zahra, kneeling in front of her. "Let me take a look." Reluctantly, she removed her hand, revealing a deep gash that ran along her side. The edges of the wound were jagged, and the faint glow of her skin had dulled around it. Ethan's brows furrowed as he worked, cleaning the injury with practiced efficiency. "This isn't from the crash, is it?" he asked, his voice low. Zahra shook her head. "The hunters. One of them caught me just before we fled. If it hadn't been for Ael." Her voice trailed off, her gaze dropping. Ethan didn't press her, though her words only deepened the pit in his stomach. She wasn't just running from danger, she had already survived it, barely. And now, she was trusting him to keep her and her son alive. "You're lucky it didn't go deeper," he said, his tone softer now. "But you're going to need rest. I can only patch this up so much." Zahra met his eyes, a flicker of gratitude passing through her expression. "Thank you?" Before Ethan could respond, Ael's voice cut through the air. "I hear something!" Ethan's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. A faint scraping sound echoed from the tunnel, growing louder with each passing second. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the wind. "They've found us," Zahra whispered, her face paling. Ethan moved quickly, positioning himself between the entrance and the others. His grip on the rifle was steady, his mind racing. The scraping grew louder, closer, until a shadow appeared at the edge of the chamber. It wasn't the winged creature. The figure stepped into the light of the glowing fungi, its armor gleaming with an otherworldly sheen. It was tall and humanoid, but its movements were unnervingly precise, like a predator stalking its prey. In its hand, it held a weapon that hummed with dangerous energy. Ethan's finger hovered over the trigger, his heart pounding. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and commanding. The hunter tilted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto Ethan. And then, with a voice like grinding metal, it spoke. "Give them to me, and I'll let you live." Ethan didn't flinch. Not a chance. The hunter raised its weapon, and Ethan braced himself. The standoff was over. The air in the cavern was thick, every breath weighted with the impending violence that lingered just out of reach. Ethan stood firm, his rifle trained on the hunter before him. The creature's armor shimmered faintly under the glow of the bioluminescent fungi, giving it an almost spectral appearance. Behind Ethan, Zara and Aiel clung to the shadows, their fear palpable but silent. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, though his heart pounded against his ribcage like a war drum. "You've got one chance to leave," he said, his finger brushing the rifle's trigger. "Walk away now, and this doesn't end badly for you." The hunter tilted its head, the movement inhumanly smooth. Its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan, and then it spoke again, its voice a chilling metallic rasp. "You're protecting them out of sentiment. It will cost you your life. Hand them over, and you can still walk away." Ethan's lips curled into a grim smile. "You talk too much." The hunter moved first, raising its weapon with deadly precision. A burst of energy illuminated the chamber, its sharp hum followed by a concussive blast that sent shards of rock flying. Ethan dove to the side, rolling into a crouch as the blast scorched the air where he'd been standing. Without hesitation, he returned fire, the echo of his rifle reverberating through the cavern. "Stay down!" Ethan barked over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the chaos. Zara shielded Aiel with her body, her eyes locked on the unfolding fight. The hunter was fast, inhumanly so. It weaved between the stalagmites with an unnerving grace, its weapon firing bursts of energy that lit the cavern like lightning strikes. Ethan gritted his teeth, using the terrain to his advantage. He darted behind cover, his sharp eyes tracking the hunter's movements, waiting for an opening. "You're outmatched, human," the hunter taunted, its voice echoing eerily off the cavern walls. "Surrender now, and I might make your death swift." Ethan smirked, his adrenaline surging. "You think I'm scared of you?" He popped out from behind cover, firing a precise shot that grazed the hunter's shoulder. Sparks flew as the armor absorbed the impact, and the hunter let out a guttural snarl. In the shadows, Zara's breathing was shallow, her hand gripping Aiel's shoulder tightly. She knew Ethan was buying them time, but she also knew it wouldn't last. Her mind raced, weighing their slim chances of survival. Her gaze flicked to the small device strapped to her wrist, the last piece of working technology she had salvaged from her ship. It was damaged, but if she could get close enough to the hunter, she might be able to overload its systems. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of combat. He didn't respond, too focused on keeping the hunter at bay. Zara's jaw tightened. If they were going to survive this, she couldn't wait for him to create an opportunity, she had to make one. "Stay here," she whispered to Aiel, her tone firm but gentle. The boy's golden eyes widened in fear, but he nodded, clutching the thermal blanket around him. Zara moved with quiet determination, staying low as she crept along the cavern's edge. Her side ached with every step, but she pushed the pain aside, her focus unyielding. She watched Ethan and the hunter trade blows, the air between them alive with fire and fury. The hunter lunged, its blade-like arm extension slashing through a stalagmite as Ethan narrowly dodged. "You're persistent," it hissed, its glowing eyes narrowing. "But persistence without power is futile." Ethan didn't reply, his attention snapping to Zara as he caught a glimpse of her movement. His gut clenched. Zaira, no! He shouted, his voice laced with panic. But she was already in motion. With a burst of speed that belied her injury, she launched herself at the hunter, activating the device on her wrist. The hunter spun toward her, its weapon raised, but it was too late. Zaira slammed the device against its chest, a surge of blue energy erupting from the contact point. The hunter let out a distorted roar as its systems faltered, sparks flying from its armor. The force of the explosion sent both Zaira and the hunter sprawling to the ground. Ethan didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his rifle aimed squarely at the hunter's head. It writhed on the ground, its armor crackling with unstable energy. You will regret this, it rasped, its voice fractured and weak. Not today, Ethan growled, pulling the trigger. The shot rang out, silencing the hunter for good. Its body went limp, the glow in its eyes fading to black. The cavern fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft dripping of water and the ragged breathing of its occupants. Ethan lowered his rifle, his gaze snapping to Zaira. She lay on her side, her chest heaving as she struggled to sit up. Zaira, he said, rushing to her. What the hell were you thinking? She looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and defiance. Thinking that you needed help, she said, her voice weak but resolute. Ethan shook his head, his frustration tempered by relief. You could have gotten yourself killed. But I didn't, she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. And neither did you. A soft whimper drew their attention, and Ethan turned to see Ael peeking out from behind the rock where he had been hiding. Is it over? The boy asked, his voice small. Ethan nodded, his shoulders sagging. Yeah, kid. It's over. Ael ran to Zaira, throwing his arms around her neck. She winced but hugged him tightly, murmuring reassurances into his hair. Ethan watched them, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He didn't understand it, this fierce protectiveness that had taken root within him. But as he looked at Zaira and Ael, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them. Not as long as he drew breath. We need to move, Ethan said after a moment, his voice cutting through the quiet. That was just one. If there are more out there, they'll know something went wrong. Zaira nodded, her strength slowly returning. Where will we go? Ethan glanced at the tunnel ahead, the faint glow of the fungi casting long shadows. Somewhere safe, he said, his tone firm. I'll get you there. I promise. As they prepared to leave, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The hunters, the creature, the crash, everything pointed to a larger storm brewing on the horizon. But for now, he focused on the two lives he had sworn to protect, determined to face whatever came next.